And our final speaker for this session is Ngiare Brown. She's going to talk about culture, policy and development.
Gamarada mitigar gurung buruk. It's welcome. A friend is happy to see you. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this beautiful country and the rainforest Aboriginal peoples, and Auntie Joanne for finding me in the foyer and not only welcoming me to this really interesting space but to beautiful country. I'm Yuin Nation, so I'm from the south coast of New South Wales. Not so tropical but extraordinarily beautiful. And I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to participate, and particularly to Professor Sandra Harding. It's your fault, okay? So whatever happens from now on is on you, darling. I've also predicated my presentation this afternoon on the fact that we've had a big, juicy demographic brain present, and also the lovely Warren on not only the assets of Aboriginal people, but of course his own assets. So I'm going to look at how we unlock the potential of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob, particularly through cultural inclusion. So it might sound a bit random, but bear with me. I know it's the last session, but hopefully it might come together towards the end. Because I believe if we're thinking about the future of tropical economies, it lies in our ability and our desire to be able to embrace and capitalise on social and cultural diversity across Northern Australia, and looking for innovative perspectives on identifying and leveraging our assets, so land, cultural practices, Indigenous intellectual property, for example, and not only natural resources or manufacturing or tourism, but research and development in agriculture or medical research, for example. So if you look at traditional medicines and practices, in tropical areas, and I know that there's some sexy, nerdy work going on with vaccine development for dengue and for rheumatic fever and for scabies, for example, but also exploring how we diversify our income streams. So social innovation and social impact approaches, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, that look at complex social issues in order to be able to create stronger local and regional economies. Now, let's be clear. Look, I'm a doctor by trade, so I am completely out of my comfort zone here, but I'll stick to what I know. And so what I'm interested in is how we look at big picture policy, social wellbeing and systems perspectives in order to be able to unlock the potential and enable thriving social and economic futures, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but not forgetting or underestimating the contribution that actually makes to the rest of the community and to the rest of the country. I'm a techno doofus, honey. Oh, yep, there you go. Thank you, darling. Don't call me professor for nothing. So if we look at, we snapshot some of the demographics across Northern Australia. Generally, though, we have higher fertility rates as Aboriginal mobs, some more than others. I'm saying on average. I've got 2 kids. Warren has 10, but is working on others. So between us, we'll have a baker's dozen. So nationally, around 60% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob are under 25 years of age. So that's quite extraordinary. So the population pyramid, whilst for the rest of Australia has, the middle-age spread going on, and lots of us are living longer, for Aboriginal mob, it's still very much pyramidal. Our life expectancy remains at about 20 years less than a non-Aboriginal population. Only about 5% of us are living beyond 65 years of age. So there's a real spread there in terms of the potential of human capital and all of our young mob and how we engage them and we embrace, nurture and grow them, but also taking into consideration the very early loss of knowledge, contribution and expertise as we lose our elders too early. So if you look at Cairns, there's over 13,000 Aboriginal mob and Torres Strait Islanders. The median age is 20 years, which I think is quite extraordinary because nationally the median age is around what? Please tell me I'm wrong, but around 30, 32 I think, so quite an extraordinary difference. 57% under 24 years of age, and a slightly larger proportion are actually female, so we need to be thinking about those spreads as well. In Darwin, around 12,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob, around 23 years of age on average, and in Broome, so I'm just sort of making these communities up now, but around 4,500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And again, the median age is around 23. So we're extraordinarily young. And although I am well past that demographic, it means that when we're considering our responsibilities to how we engage and educate that mob, it's extraordinarily important. And as I mentioned, it represents significant potential and opportunity, not only in terms of Aboriginal capacity, but how we address broader social issues and cultural engagement, Aboriginal recognition, but also how we change some of our really deeply ingrained national behaviours, particularly when we address cultural diversity in Australia, but also across the other tropical regions. And one more for the dummies. That's a down arrow, honey. You might need to help me there, please, nicely. So, whilst that's all going on, so at the moment you're probably aware that the priorities for the government for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander as part of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy are largely around school attendance, employment and economic independence. And it worked for you, why?
Did we go the wrong way?
Wrong way. That's it. No, yes, it is.
Just that one.
I keep pressing one way. You stand there. Don't go anywhere. School attendance, employment and economic independence. However, you can't achieve any of those things. You can't get our kids to school. We can't get them educated. We can't land jobs if we're not literate. We cannot be employed if we aren't healthy. And so, just to sound like a nerd when I talk to ministers and others, I call these the preconditions of participation. We must be healthy, we must be well, we must be a coherent and cohesive part of the community. So good health is your physical, your psychological, also your cultural and your social well-being across the life cycle. It's about intrauterine, neonatal, infant and early childhood development. It's about environmental infrastructure. It's also about bonding, parenting and positive relationships. And it's interesting, we know that in order to be able to break the cycle of offending, incarceration and recidivism, good, positive, healthy relationships are essential to those environments. So how do we address those? Having positive aspirations as individuals but also as systems, so raising the expectations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob, but also raising the expectations of those within the systems which are responsible for our growth and development. So if you go to school and you have teachers there that expect very little of you because you're Aboriginal, then how are you yourself then going to perhaps aim beyond your supposed station in life? If there is no value placed upon education, performance and sustainable employment within your family or your community, how do you then develop those aspirations and expectations? It's also important to think about, well, what then develops purpose for mob and what are their motivations to be able to participate. Safe environments are incredibly important, so within the home and for the family, but also within your community, and then also the other spaces like education and in the workplace. And I know that a lot of students in primary and secondary schools, but particularly in universities, they're often put upon to be apologists for Indigenous issues and also to, they in turn to teach the teachers or to teach the rest of their class when they themselves are there to pursue their own aspirations. The 3AQ of service delivery, so they have to be acceptable, accessible and appropriate, and of course of good quality. It's not enough to get the kids to school, for example, and the arse on seats is never enough. You have to be able to provide quality education, people who are passionate about being there and about growing people into their place. And that includes, medical services, it includes educational institutions, and I've mentioned the workplace. Come on now, doll. You just need to stand right there. Oh, and I work on my biceps. You do. That would be awesome. So, I did admit that I'm a techno doofus, so please excuse me for that. So I think most of us are well aware of the social determinants are, and so they basically describe the conditions within which we are born, we grow, we develop, and we contribute. But they're mostly responsible for, the inequities that we experience and social disparities and the social gradient between populations. And it's shaped in turn by all of your other, social environments, your political and your economic environments. Hit me. See, that worked very nicely. Thank you. And so, that stepped out some of the social determinants that we're all particularly familiar with. But, my perspective is that often with a social determinants perspective, it's very much from a deficit perspective. So if you're not employed, you're not engaged, you're not healthy, you're low on the totem pole, then your outcomes are poor across the other determinants. So I've been looking at... hit me, Dom. Thanks. I've been looking at another perspective, and it's around the development and the articulation of the language of the cultural determinants of health. Now, everybody has a cultural origin, whether you know it or not, whether you acknowledge it or not. It's not specific to Aboriginal mob, to other Indigenous peoples, to migrant populations. Every single one of us has an origin and has a story and has a narrative. And if you know that, if you learn that, if you embrace that, it will actually make you stronger in whatever context you then engage. Yes, please, John. So for a few years, and that'll be, I'm sorry, it might be a little bit small, squint, hard, looking at how we explore and articulate what the cultural determinants of health are. So using a strength-based approach to acknowledge that stronger connections to culture, to land, to language, to cultural practices, build stronger individual and collective identities and a greater sense of self-esteem, resilience, and then improved outcomes across the social determinants of health. And there's a growing evidence base that's come out of Western Australia in the work by Fiona Stanley, but also stuff in Canada, for example, with Chandler and Lalonde, that actually demonstrates the link between cultural identity and practice and improved outcomes, particularly for adolescent wellbeing. And I've just used the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a bit of a thematic framework, but they include but aren't limited to self-determination, freedom from discrimination, assimilation and destruction of culture, the preservation, revitalisation and promotion of languages and cultural practices, but also the protection and promotion of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous intellectual property, which is a really sexy, sort of difficult thing in the international arena at the moment, but also understanding law, L-O-R-E, law, and our cultural responsibilities to one another, but also to the broader community, and that's incredibly important in our communities and always has been. Yes, thanks, Tom. So it's probably a good thing that Minister Hockey's gone, because this gets a bit sort of hippie, but it's how we then think about cultural policies and culture in all policies and how we action some of those cultural determinants. So, irrespective of your discipline or your portfolio, education, employment or some of the health-specific stuff, you need to cross-cut the culture in all policies, your social determinants and your cultural determinants of health and wellbeing in order to best inform appropriate, relevant and evidence-informed responses, including resourcing implementation, but also how we look at monitoring and evaluation. So UNESCO, for example, has developed a suite of tools which gathers together a range of instruments, globally, looking at how we strengthen the role of culture in all areas of public policy. And they developed it for policymakers, government representatives, ministers and their departments and bureaucracies, but also all of those that work in development areas. So it aims to encourage decision makers to be able to integrate some of those cultural perspectives into the economic and development sectors, but also improve the practical applications across strategy, policies and programs. So, if we can land on Mars or the moon, if we have apps that manage money or allow us to communicate globally with billions of others, or find a soulmate. Is that called Tinder, Warren? I think you know about that. If we can make the Kardashians famous, then surely we can look at ways of being able to develop and implement a culture in all policies approach. Yes, please, Tom. Such that culture and development, although they probably sound like they belong at either end of the spectrum, they're not mutually exclusive. And in fact, some of our best national and international evidence demonstrates that they're mutually beneficial and they are essential to sustained social and economic growth. I'll kind of rush through. Skip the next one, please. Nah, keep going. Yeah, next one. Thank you, lovely. So there's a suite of indicators that UNESCO has developed in order to match with some of that work, and so it's looking at how culture it belongs as a sector of economic activity. looking at, and not just Indigenous cultures, but it's also about the moral and religious fibre of a community and how that adds value to development and can better engage populations, but also how it underpins and improves frameworks for social cohesion and peace more broadly, which I think is incredibly important. Yes, thanks. Pretty. So, looking at some of the dimensions, and these indicators aren't, they're not detailed as such because they're meant to be a responsive and flexible framework for the application in a variety of contexts. But it looks at culture as a dimension of economy, of education, of governance, institutionality. That's a great word. Getting greater levels of social participation and awareness, but also gender equality and communication. And just because Warren and I are lurking, I thought I'd better sort of touch very briefly on the role of council, for example, and how we're looking, and he's touched on this specifically, but how, well, my perspective is that I really want to see our governments move from ideology to an evidence base to inform their policy decision making. Does that make sense? And their resourcing. So, the whole, well, I think this should happen, so therefore I think you should do this. And I'll just pluck something out of a various orifice and then let's just make that happen. And we'll dive in midstream and we won't be evidence informed and then we'll wonder why it doesn't work. It's been the hallmark of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs for as long as I can remember. And though I look young, I've been doing this for a while. Aboriginal mob are the anchor. Governments, bureaucrats, departments will come and go, but we've been doing this for quite some time, so there's much to be learnt from the way in which we do things, and we will keep them centred. So the whole notion of outcomes-focused interventions in evidence-based policy and resourcing, monitoring and evaluation is critical, and it's what we've been saying for decades. So the Indigenous Advisory Council, there's a very sexy mix of disciplines and experience, from business to education and to health. Hit me please, Tom. And under the... Oh, back one please, Tom. Yep, that's it. And under the new advancement strategy, they've gone from about 152 different funding streams, for example, some long-term, some sort of individual 12 to 24 months worth of resourcing, to 5 larger thematic areas. And for any of you that are looking for some funding at the moment for some of this stuff, there is a funding round that's open and it closes on the 7th of October, so make sure you get tickled up there. So within that, there are, I think, some significant opportunities for us to be able to contribute specifically in terms of not only the perspectives of Aboriginal mob, but the focus on remote Australia and in particular across the Northern Belt. Yes, please, Tom. There's a real interest in that entrepreneurial and sort of business spirit and how not only do we get Aboriginal mob and others into employment, for example, but how we foster our own opportunities. And in particular, they've been looking at leveraging exemplars from across the tropical north, including Cape York and Arakoon, Arnhem Land, and in the top reaches of far northern Western Australia. And more specifically, it's looking at Aboriginal business, but also opportunities that are relative to context, both social, cultural and geographical. So, there are helicopter charters in Arakoon, for example, and croc farms in far north Queensland and in the top end, pearling and tourism in the Torres Strait Islands, but also in the far north of Western Australia. So many significant national and global industries that have been built on the contributions and the expertise of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples over the years. Yes, please, Tom. I'm also really interested in how we look at interdisciplinary collaborations and apply what might be familiar models differently. So, okay, I'm a doc, I do public health stuff. In fact, I did my public health and tropical medicine here at James Cook. Go alumni. So how we invert the public health model, for example, so instead of looking at, say, risk and prevention, we address potential and enabling. from a population level through to the individual perspective. Does that kind of make sense? So if, for example, in a public health perspective, you look at primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. So primary prevention is looking at population level education and awareness. Secondary prevention is looking at at-risk and vulnerable individuals, but also those who are diagnosed and treated early for disease. And then your tertiary prevention is around people affected by an illness or an event, and how you provide ongoing care and rehabilitation. Does that kind of make sense? So if you think about that maybe a little differently or apply it here. So, you know, a primary perspective for development is looking at population level education and awareness that's relevant to financial literacy or budgeting within some of the policy perspectives at the moment. How we develop entrepreneurs and big ideas, imagination and innovation. Because, you know, our governments have been so risk averse that they stifle innovation. They're so afraid of making a mistake or discovering that something doesn't work that they won't take the additional steps to actually see whether we can learn lessons from what doesn't work in order to inform what we can do better. Secondary potential and enabling is to be able to specifically identify and then foster talent. So just like an athletes program, for example. And you create incubators or environments within which you are then able to build and nurture and grow those skills. And then your tertiary perspectives are around intensive support, intervention, but also investment, evidence-informed, for economic and social impact around those particular ideas. Does that kind of make sense? Well, it makes sense to me, and so that's the most important thing. Hit me, please, Tom. I like that photo. So, you know, and some simple first steps. So what do we then actually do? What are some tangible, practical approaches? National curriculum that is inclusive, respectful, honest, and that acknowledges the ongoing contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob to this country. So not a historical whitewash, but just tell the truth about black and white history and contribution, so that every child born here, every child that comes here, every young adult is exposed to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia, our history, our culture and our contribution. A cultural determinants approach to early childhood education, health and social justice, because that will get our children to school. It will encourage improved academic performance and facilitate pathways into employment and financial independence, and it will foster social cohesion and a more inclusive and representative national identity. In the Territory, I had because I lived in Darwin or out of Darwin for a number of years, I had that privilege. We also did an impact assessment on components of the Northern Territory intervention. And one of the strongest messages that we received from senior people, from parents, from young people, was that whilst they understood the incredible value of going to school, of education and performance, there was no passion. Teachers were not interested in the contribution that they could make to the lives of those children. They were there because they had a job. There was no acknowledgement within the curriculum of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples or recognition that they were valued or they were important. There was a deconstruction of the teaching of language, of the engagement of senior local people to be able to engage in the school. So it actually undermined all of the perspectives. It devalued the contribution of Aboriginal mob. And they said, well, why would I want that for my child when I want them to know who they are and to be able to take that with them every step of their future lives? So unless we build systems and have practices that are respectful and inclusive and relevant to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob, you will never fully engage us in the manner that you expect. And without that acknowledgement and that consideration, then it's assimilation, and I really don't want to see us move back to that. You know, looking at place-based and assets-focused economic development, being able to leverage cultural knowledge and practices, and also looking at that research and development agenda and place-based industry investments. So whether that's in schools or the vet sector, in health services, or it might be urban planning, environmental management, renewable energy, art, architecture, agriculture, crop farms. And of course, it's incredibly important that our regional universities step up and take responsibility for this and lead, but also they open the space to new and emerging but also established talent here and think about how they better attract the intellectual property back into Australia. And I've been dinged, so thanks very much.
Thank you for that.